Hello, this is Unexplained Arkansas, the podcast, and I'm your host, Lisa. A quick business. By the time that this comes out, it will be Monday, whatever day that is. Is that the 3rd? I don't even know. Literally, our live show will be 5 days away. 5 days, people. We are so excited. If you don't have tickets yet, just show up at the door. We'll be able to do cash app, and debit and credit cards at the door. So it'll be the perfect date night and girls' night and whatnot. We're going to have an awesome show regarding the haunted history of the White County Courthouse. The show is 9 p.m. Saturday, February 8th at the Rialto Theater in downtown Searcy. Park downtown. Be prepared for an awesome time and freebies. So yay. So this is episode number 74. This is part 2 of John Wayne Gacy's connection to Arkansas. So if you haven't listened to part 1, go back and listen. We left off in December of 1987. And just an disclaimer, this is John Wayne Gacy. These are horrendous acts done by a horrible serial killer. So just FYI, listener discretion on that. So there is going to be discussion of some terrible things. So, yeah. So we left off December of 1978. And the police, they had been after Gacy for 10 days doing surveillance on him. And so now they are in the crawl space of his home. They had gotten their second search warrant on his home. The first one, they just found some odds and ends, but they didn't find what they were looking for, which is the teenager, the 15-year-old Rob Peast. That's who they're after. But they did find the 3 left femur bones, and then they regrouped. So, because they were like, okay, we've got 3 bodies here. So they've been trying to locate, like I said, 15-year-old Rob Peast that had gone missing December 11th. So these bones, they knew were not Rob because they were fully decomposed. So the question is, where is Rob? And what all and who all is under this crawl space? Like, this is horrific. So the first 3 or 4 bodies are uncovered in the crawl space, and this was by about December 23rd when this is going on. So Gacy is in custody, and he has been talking. He talked to his attorney. He talked to the police, even though his attorney was kind of asking him to, quote unquote, not talk. But Gacy was a talker, and Gacy was definitely talking about what he did. So the police are hearing from Gacy that there could be around 26 young men's bodies in this crawl space. And when I say crawl space, I know that, in Arkansas, you're kind of thinking, very little room. This crawl space evidently had, there was kind of like a trap door, like a door that kind of was hidden, and then you go down a ladder. So it isn't like what we think of a crawl space, I don't think. It's not quite a basement. It is a little crouchy, but yeah. But there is a ladder to get down to it. So it's not like just a few inches or something. There's room to be digging. There's room to be in it, so to speak. So, yes. Where am I? Sorry. So, he's telling the police that there could be 26 bodies under the house, give or take. Very cavalier about this. So, Gacy is also stating that he has dumped some bodies in the Des Plaines River and the Illinois River because he pretty much ran out of room under his home. And an anthropologist and a dental expert have been called in because this is 1978. This is the only way like dental records are the only way for them to be able to identify a decomposed body is the dental records, at least at this time. DNA won't even be used in this type of thing until 1986. And then I'm sure at that point it was very new. Yeah. So this is the 1978 of it all. So they're asking, so the police are having, you know, what do you call them? News conferences, and they are urging the public to call in and send them dental records, and really x-rays, but dental records are good. Anything that they could see the teeth of any young men that are missing. So they're urging the families to do this. And so much is going on. I mean, I can't even imagine, they're finding bodies. Gacy's in custody. He's talking. They're trying to figure out, how many bodies, like, there's a lot going on. And this is December 23rd. So December 24th and the 25th, the police pause on the search of the home for at least the holiday. However, they do have many police patrolling and guarding the house. I mean, you have a situation where people had already started to, surround the house. So they do have the house, protected by police, although they did halt the actual search and excavation for the holiday. They also, in the meantime, they also have like local firemen and other authorities actively looking in the rivers. But this is Illinois, and this is, winter, and I know that's hard for Arkansans to imagine, but it's just going, it's just a different situation with the river. There is ice involved, and it is freezing cold. So they've got the winter, Chicago, just think about that. And this is actually, they don't know it yet, but they are going to have what they're going to call the blizzard of 79 coming. So it's about to hit in January. So they've got a lot going on at the same time with their winter weather. So the search does resume December 26th under the home. So on the 26th, they literally just discover 5 more bodies in the crawl space. Additionally, they had found a body actually November 12th in the Des Plaines River that same year, so about a month or so before, that they do tie to Gacy as a victim, and his name is Frank Landing Inn. So he is confirmed through, like, his identity is confirmed through fingerprints and dental records, and his father, who is also Frank, I believe. So Frank was only 19 years old, and he had gone missing like right November 4th of 78. So literally he went missing the 4th, and his body was found the 12th, and they didn't know who he was. So yes, it is surmised by the medical examiner that Frank, he was, this is horrible, he is strangled to death, and his own underwear had been stuffed like deep within his mouth. And this would be kind of a reoccurring thing with the bodies. Gacy would tell in interviews or something that, when he killed the bodies and he would put them in the crawl space, he found that the bodies would ooze. And so this was a way not only for like strangulation and, that kind of thing, but it would kind of keep in any of that. I'm not going to get any more into that, but that's just terrible. So this is something that Gacy would do in most of the bodies. So most of the bodies were found this way. Gacy did tell the police upon his arrest that he had dumped about 5 bodies into the river from a bridge on Highway 55. So the he lives in Des Plaines, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago, and the Des Plaines River is kind of like a tributary to the Illinois River, and the Illinois River eventually flows into the Mississippi. But kind of give you all a picture of this in your head. So I-55 is up there. So he is close to the I-55 bridge. And so he's just saying that he believes it's 5 bodies. The thing about Gacy is he doesn't, it's like he'll talk and he'll give things, but he didn't even, I mean, it's not like he even got to know these victims. He didn't know names. He didn't know anything. And then at times he would, say things. And then later on, as you'll see, he's going to completely deny. So, yeah. Yeah, it's just frustrating. He is frustrating. So December 27th, Gacy is front page news, really the Chicago Tribune, and really across the nation. I mean, it's horrendous. I mean, I can't even imagine. Like, it's awful. I mean, we think about the awfulness of like the Rex Howerman and him being like the Long Island serial killer, and and allegedly or suspectedly, but and then also the the Idaho murders, and it's just horrendous. But I mean, at this point they think that there's like 30 bodies, so they don't really know how many, but it's just hard to imagine that. It's just terrible. So on the 27th, they do find 8 more bodies, young men. These are all young men that they're finding. They know that part from the bones. At this point, they're just people. I mean, all they're doing around the clock is excavating. And they are literally having to take the house apart. I mean, they're lifting up floorboards. They need access. They're trying to get to all of the crawl space. I mean, it's just, as you can imagine. And I should say, they have to take the house apart to get to these bodies because there's just so many. And so far, they literally have like 18 to this point bodies that they have found. And at this point, this is the 27th, they have not identified any bodies at this point. I mean, this was going to take time. And so most of these bodies are reflecting like similar to what I said Frank's body was, like with underwear stuffed into we're talking deep into their throats, and rags stuffed deep into their mouths. And some of the bodies do definitely show signs of strangulation because they literally have ropes tied around their neck and such. So they are showing signs of strangulation. So the men at the crawl space site are really, anyone having to come by the site at all, whether it's the state attorneys or whatever, they are all experiencing this horror. I mean, it's just absolutely horrendous, something that they've never encountered in their lives, never. The state attorney, his name is Carey, commented this site was the most horrendous thing he'd ever seen. And Dr. Robert Stein, who was the Cook County medical examiner, commented that the officers excavating were having to be extremely careful. The crawl space, if you can imagine, had all these toxic gases that were being released from the bodies, like hydrogen sulfide and methane were released. And so they're working in this environment. And I don't know if you can imagine like the smell of it all. And so literally the officers were just sick. I mean, just sickened. I will post pictures of all of this. And I will say this is 1978. They do have on gloves. Some of them are wearing like hard hats, but there is no like full knowledge of like PPE. There's nothing like that. And I would imagine if this had happened in today's, time, they would be like in full hazmat attire to do a job like this. Like they would, no way they're just going in, breathing all this in. So it's hard to imagine this site, period. It's just disgusting and so sad. They're having to pull human beings from makeshift graves. Ugh. Yeah, and these humans have been there so long, obviously. So it's just sad. It's sad and sickening. So now Gacy, and again, he has been talking to the police, like we mentioned before. So the police are kind of asking him, okay, John, like, lay out where these bodies are. Well, so he literally lays out like a crude map under the house with all kinds of lines and X's and such. And so, he also does state that one victim was buried in his garage and then covered in cement. So he literally goes to the house. He takes the police to the house, to the garage, and he marks an X where he buried one of the victims. And he was exactly right. So his story was backed up. So he would state kind of at first there was only like his story. Again, his story. He at first would tell the police that he only killed one person and that it was in self-defense. So again, this is the kind of thing the police are dealing with. It's like he tells them stuff and then he retracts it, or he'll tell them, oh, it was self-defense. It's just back and forth with him. And then, of course, once he actually had lawyered up, and his lawyer is the Sam Amaranti, like the Sam tells him, their strategy or whatever. So then there's kind of a point where Gacy is talking to the police, and then he's saying things like, well, I didn't do any of the killings, but Jack did. Like, I'm John. There was a Jack that killed him. Just kind of trying to build on some sort of multiple identity situation. And the cops had actually found a book in Gacy's home. It was like a criminal law book, and it had been like bookmarked where it talked about multiple personalities as far as how it affected criminal law. So, he's just they're trying different tactics. This is kind of the direction that his attorney is going into, because obviously they're going to say he's insane. It's so horrendous that, yes, but they're going to try to say that he is criminally insane. Like, that's their only defense there. And of course, John's not stupid. So he is a lot of things, but he is not stupid. So this is kind of what, again, the police are dealing with. They're dealing with him, coming and going with his answers. Sometimes he'll not talk. Sometimes he's talking, and then he's trying to put all the blame on other people, including a made-up persona named Jack. So, yes. But by the 28th, so by December 28th, Gacy is no longer talking at this moment. So he's not talking anymore about the case. The police are still working. Of course, they're doing all the things. They're having to track down all the things. People are excavating. There's just a lot going on. They do find on the 28th 4 more bodies. And they do have all kinds of people. They're, when you look at old pictures during this time of the search into their house, there's people everywhere around the house. So there's onlookers, there's the news crews are everywhere. Neighbors are out there watching. It's a spectacle. And if this was happening in my neighborhood, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'd be out there too. I'd be like, what is going on? This was fascinating. And again, every single day, front page news in the Chicago Tribune and across the country. So, yeah, just a lot going on. And the people are watching this, and they know that a lot is going on because they can literally see body bags coming out of the house. So, it's not like they have up any type of tent situation going on. So on the December 29th, so more bodies are discovered. The new body count total is up to 28 bodies. And that's unclear if that means also Frank's body from the river or if this is just underneath the house. But 28 so far is what they're saying. They do have a national hotline set up. It is established for people to call directly just about the Gacy case. And that's kind of to help in the investigation and identification. Because at this point, they really couldn't, quote unquote, charge Gacy with these deaths of these men without some type of identification going on. So that's what they're really working on. Now, he has been charged already. They are pinning, they had him in custody just because of that marijuana bit, but they do have him charged for Frank's death and then Rob Peast. Even though they don't have Rob's body, they have already pinned that on him. So they do have him indicted for those two young men at this point. So the Chicago Tribune, of course, like I mentioned, is running front page articles every day. So on Saturday, December 30th, they run an article just on Dr. Stein. That was interesting. So they quote Dr. Stein, and he is the medical examiner, he discusses the horrible stench that hit him the first time he entered the home, and that some of the bodies were literally buried 6 feet deep. So this was, again, this isn't a crawl space like we think of in Arkansas, but it is, it's a legit crawl space, but these bodies were not just buried, they were buried 6 feet in. Now, on top of that, I should say, these bodies were even stacked. So there might be like 3 bodies stacked on top of each other. Yes. So, of course, when they first dug and found those 3 left femurs, right off the bat, like think of that, these bodies were literally right on top of each other. Because he capitalized on his space. This wasn't a huge home. I think I heard about 1,000, maybe 1,200 square feet tops. So yes, just horrendous. Other items were also being found in the crawl space graves. They were finding clothing, jewelry, and he had stated in most cases a good thing. Dr. Stein was saying that the full jaws were intact, so that was at least helpful in the identification processing. Because sometimes they would find that killers would remove the jaws, they would remove the teeth or whatever. So they were incredibly happy, at least, that the full jaws were being found of all of the bodies. There wasn't he had buried the full bodies, basically. He hadn't gotten rid of bits and pieces. So, anywho, so they were intact. They're helpful in the identification. So the identification is underway, and literally by the next few days, some of these crawl space bodies would be announced with identity. So December 31st, 1978 is a Sunday. So the Tribune actually runs 2 first page stories on Gacy. The first is straight from Little Rock, Arkansas. So they had interviewed what they call Gacy's younger sister, and we did discuss that Gacy's younger sister is Karen. And the article is centered around the agony of Gacy's family. And in the article, Karen discusses how normal John was and how normal their family life was. It does discuss that he did have blackouts and seizures growing up. It did mention that he had had an accident on a playground at age 11, and I think the family's just trying to be like, well, maybe this attributed to his, problems. He did have a blood clot they had found. The blood clot would plague him and kind of give him these blackouts and seizures, and we had kind of discussed how he had missed so much school in high school, so that was one of the things. He spent a lot of time in the hospital, growing up. And the article does also go on to discuss that Karen is married and she has 3 kids, and that her mother, Marion, does live with her. And so they all do live in around Little Rock at that time. And we'll kind of further discuss that. So that is the connection, Karen. So, and then Marion, of course, because Marion evidently moved in with Karen at some point. So kind of in the later 70s. So all of this kind of, let's see, pause. So basically, the article is just discussing how they are all beside themselves. She's, Karen's wondering how her mom is going to make it through it, And luckily, I think we had talked about it before, Marion does not pass away until about 11 years later. So she passes away in 1989. And Karen discusses how much she feels for the families of the young men, and that what they were doing is just praying a lot for just the whole situation. And she does talk about, all the good things that John did and the loving brother he was to her, and that they would stand behind him. So, I mean, like I said before in part one, Karen had a very, very loving, close relationship with her brother John. So this was devastating for obviously all the victims' family, but definitely Gacy's family as well. Just devastating. So not on the first page, but still an article in the paper. So there was still more article. I mean, there's so much here. So Gacy was pretty much encompassing all the news. And I mean, this is the Chicago Tribune. This is one of the biggest papers in the country. So 2 articles in that same paper on that day, the 31st. So it does talk about a picture. It shows a picture of Gacy. He's actually being restrained to a bed in the prison hospital, and evidently a sheriff named Officer Elrod with the Cook County Sheriff's Office, it said that he was the one that released this picture to the press and that he had resigned. So he got in trouble. Another article was actually interviews with workers that were literally working in the crawl space. So they describe working 8-hour long days, and they are pulling out skulls and hip bones and legs and pelvises and arms just out of the ground. They describe the morbidness of it all and how it was affecting them personally. They would literally have to take their like eating and drinking breaks in the house, in parts of the house. And they did talk about how the stench, once they were in the house, that it didn't affect things too, once they got used to it. But if they left the house and came in, or if they were coming in the morning, I mean, it was horrendous. So basically they would go nose blind to it once they were in it. But every time they left and came back, it's just hitting them, this horrible smell. They do discuss how depressing and macabre it is, but they all talk about how they have a job to do, and there's really no words. And me in my head, I guess, is I do the laundry around here. I'm just thinking, did they they came home with these clothes. I mean, did they wash them with I don't know. I would have been like, okay, we're washing this stuff. We're just going to light this stuff on fire. I don't even know. I don't even know how you would get the stench out, and just thinking about just the cross contamination. Ew. I'm just one of those people. Ugh. It's just grossing me out. So January 1st, 1979, 3 more identities are tied to bodies. So they are, so we talked about the one article about the interviews and such. So there was an article that announces the first victim found in the home is identified through dental records on the 31st. So they do announce. So the young man's name, and he was only 18 years old. So his name is John Butkovich, and John had actually worked for Gacy. He had worked for the business for about 8 months before he went missing in August of 75. So he went missing in 75. So he had worked for Gacy pretty early. Evidently he had gone to Gacy's home to collect his final paycheck and then was never seen again. And Bukovich's body was the body in the garage that Gacy led the police to. So this article just announced another identification was also a 20-year-old man, young boy, named James Mazzara. So he had been found near the location of, remember, Frank's body in the Des Plaines River. So Mazzaro had gone missing in November of 78. So really right before all this came out. And he is thought to be one of the last victims of Gacy before Rob Peast. And they did identify James via his fingerprints. But they did not state, like they couldn't tell how he died. Just due to, I guess, decomposition or whatnot. So not first page news, just the same, but there were some other, we discussed about the prison article. Okay, so moving forward, so January 1st of 1979, 3 more identities tied to bodies. So, they've got 3 that came about on the 31st. So 17-year-old Rick Johnston, he was last seen by his mother because she had dropped him off at a concert in August of 1976. So we're talking, almost 3 years. And his body would be confirmed with dental records. 17-year-old Gregory Godzik, so he was a high school student that worked for Gacy, and he went missing in December of 1976. Now, his parents and girlfriend searched for him. His parents hired a private investigator. His girlfriend had actually went to Gacy's house looking for Greg, and Gacy had told her that Greg had run away. So he is identified with dental records, and I'm sure kind of in the back of their heads they had thought Gacy did something to begin with. But Gacy would state in court that Greg actually dug his own grave under the home. So Gacy did, and we'll get into this, and I think we had seen that Rossi and Cram, other young men that worked for him, did dig graves. So Greg had evidently, when he worked for Gacy, was digging under the house. And he would just tell these boys that he was doing plumbing work was the thing. So 19-year-old John Sick, and remember, he was the young man that the police in the very first search, they had found his class ring with initials JAS. So John went missing January 1977. He would be identified with dental records as well, and there will be more on Sick regarding his vehicle. So Gacy just kind of went back and forth on whether he was responsible for Sick or not. He did end up, Sick was very into his car. He kind of had, I guess you call it like a muscle car. So he actually took Sick's car, Gacy did, and he sold it to Mike Rossi, for $300 or something ridiculous. And anywho, I believe that there was other items that were taken. He was the one that, there were other items taken from his apartment that were missing, like his Motorola TV. So he was obviously robbed by Gacy. Gacy had his class ring that would have been on him when he killed him. And then he evidently took, other items from his apartment and took his car and sold it. So, and he had explained it at the time that John Sick had, there's a lot of these kids named John, that John had sold the car to Gacy. That's what Gacy had said at that time. So just a lot of things. And then later on, Gacy will give interviews, and we'll talk about this in 1992, and he would state during the interview that he felt like Sick was killed because of his car or something ridiculous like that. So anywho, he's so frustrating. He's always pushing the blame. So January 3rd, now we're at January 3rd, 1979. So Gacy is interviewed again. So he had kind of gone through a few days that he would not talk to the police at all, but they do interview him again, and and uh and he tells police that he's telling them they've got all the bodies, because at this point they have 27 at the house and 2 from the river. So he tells them that is it, which is a lie. So he also does tell them at that time, though, because they're really wanting to know where Rob Peast is. So he tells them at the time that he threw Rob into the river. And again, we mentioned this, a little side note, they're having this snow blizzard. Literally, it's freezing cold there. Chicago gets snow. They certainly get snow. They get cold weather, but evidently this is a huge thing. Their weather they call it a blizzard. They call it the blizzard of 79. So it was so cold, they had gotten I want to say 10 to 12 inches of snow already, and it had just dumped on them that much snow. And then it was so cold, and then another front came in that dumped a whole nother foot of snow on them. So they had snow everywhere. And again, they get snow, but this was a lot for them. So weather-wise, it's like a crazy January for them. So just keep that in mind. And of course, that's going to make it difficult all the way around for, everything. John also does describe in his interviews, he describes how his first victim, he doesn't really go into detail. And again, he doesn't keep up with these kids' names. They are just objects to him. But he talks about how he did stab to death his first victim, and that happened in 1972, and it was in his bedroom. Now, the police do find blood stains under the carpet of his bedroom that do corroborate that. And again, John doesn't know the names. He did mention that this teenager was picked up at the Greyhound bus station. That's all he mentions. So January 6th, 4 more victims are identified. So 17-year-old Michael Bonin, he had gone missing in June of 1977, and his parents had searched all the neighboring states for him. But finally, they did learn that the police had found Michael's fishing license in Gacy's home, and then they were able to hone in there and send in his dental records. 18-year-old Robert Gilroy is identified. He is actually a son of a Chicago police sergeant. He had gone missing September 27th of 1977, and he had told his parents he was headed out of town for a special horseback riding lesson, and this lesson was a big deal, and it was actually out of state in Maryland. So his parents didn't really find out right away, but as soon as they knew that he didn't make the lesson, they, of course, said that he was missing, and this was in 77. His body is identified with dental records, and he literally lived 4 houses down from Gacy. So he was just someone that Gacy had probably, picked up in the neighborhood. 20-year-old John Prestige, so he was from Michigan, but he came to Chicago to stay with a friend, and he found work with a contractor. Now, they couldn't find anything paperwork-wise, nothing definitive to link him to Gacy work, but he probably did work for him, maybe for cash. But he went missing in July of 77, and dental records confirmed his identity. 21-year-old Russell Nelson, so he was actually engaged. He was a University of Minnesota student, and he had come to Chicago to do some work with a friend of his for a contractor, like John Prestige. So nothing, again, was on paper. This could have just been, if he did any work for Gacy, it was just, I don't know, cash. But he had phoned his mother. So the last time anyone had heard from him was October 17th of 1977. And then he was never heard from again until his body was identified. January 8th, 1979. So now that identities have been procured. So Gacy is officially indicted by Cook County on these 7 counts of murder. Plus, he's indicted on aggravated kidnapping, deviant sexual assaults, and indecent liberties with a child. So Cook County prosecutor Bernard Carey, he states they will seek the death penalty and that Gacy can receive a fair trial in Cook County in response to the defense wanting to move the trial. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, this is huge. It's been in the paper, like front page news for, since it began. I don't think probably anyone in the country, hadn't heard about Gacy and what he had done. I think they'd have to, go to the moon or whatever. So I definitely see how the defense feels. And I mean, it's like, yeah, I mean, this is a bad deal. So January 9th, a body that had been found in the Illinois River, like back in June of 78. So that body is identified and linked to Gacy. It's a 20-year-old named Timothy O'Rourke. He went missing right at the time he was found. So he went missing around June. His body was found in June, kind of like Frank, or I think it was the other boy. But so he was found. So he went missing, yeah, and he was found. So this is really the summer of it all. If you see it was warmer. Let's put it this way. It was warmer weather. It wasn't the cold weather. So his body was found within 3 miles of the other 2 bodies recovered, which was Frank and then James Mazzaro. So on January 10th, Gacy pleads not guilty before Judge Louis Garippo. Gacy is very calm. He's nonchalant. Like, he doesn't show any type of emotion. None. There are 85 or so spectators in the courtroom, including Rob Peace's parents. And they do, in the paper and everything, they do describe that she just could not stop sobbing. I mean, her grief, she couldn't hold her grief in. It was just so raw and so real. I just can't even imagine her having to just deal with this and know that this monster, had gotten a hold of her son. It's horrible. So January 27th, 2 more victims are identified. So 19-year-old John Mowry, he had just actually completed 18 months of Marine training. So he had gone off Marine training camp or whatever, and he was back in Chicago on leave, and he told his parents he was going out for the evening, and he was never seen again. So this was September of 1977. Matthew Bowman is identified. He was 18 years old. He was reported missing by his sister in July of 77. So he was from the Crystal Lake area of Illinois, which is about 49 miles from Chicago. By this time now, there are 12 known victims. So this is 12 of those bodies have been identified. So moving into March, so March 9th, they're still working on the excavation. There is a body found under the driveway in an area that wasn't described by Gacy. So, yeah. So this person, this victim was wearing a wedding ring. By this time, the house is pretty much destroyed. So now they're looking at everything. Like they're having to pull up any concrete. So they're looking under outbuildings. And so Gacy had added on to the garage. Like he had added on things. He had also kind of blacktopped most of the yard. So most of his backyard, he didn't have a lot, he had some front yard grass, but he had, blacktopped most of the backyard. So they're just demolishing all this. They don't want to leave any possibility of not getting one of the bodies. So on March 16th of 1979, they do find another skeleton. So this body was found under the building that was on the add-on. So this would be the 29th body, and there's 32 tied now to Gacy total. So there was 29 in the property and then 3 more in the river. So March 17, another body is identified. This time it's 16-year-old named William Carroll. So William had gone missing on his brother's birthday, June 13th of 1976. He had told his father that he would be right back in about an hour. He had gotten into a vehicle with 3 or 4 other teens, and then he never came back. On April 9th, a truck driver finds a body near what's called the Dresden Dam, which is near where the Des Plaines River meets the Illinois River. So this is April. The driver phones in the dam lock master, and then they phone the police. So the body is determined to be 15-year-old Rob Peast. So he's finally found in April. So he, of course, had kicked off this whole thing. Rob Peast's brother would relay later on that Rob wanted to do something really big with his life. And he did. His brother said his disappearance stopped a madman, which is so true. And it's so sad that it had to happen. And some of the documentaries that I've watched, it did also say, Rob's family had such a tough time, of course, with why Rob? Why did this happen? How did it happen? And the detective, also had a tough time with this. And he pretty much said to Rob Peast's dad, he was like, you just have to look at this Gacy had never set eyes on Rob before December 11th. Rob didn't know Gacy. He just happened to talk to him in the pharmacy that day. Literally, it's the same as Rob getting hit by lightning. That's just, it's so crazy that it was just that much of a crazy coincidence. But, Gacy had no rhyme or reason. There was no rhyme or reason. He just met a person, and that's how, he took their life. He decided that that's what was going to happen. And it's so horrendous. The following day, Gacy's home is demolished. So April 10th, the home is just demolished. The local authorities, typically when this happened, evidently, they have to get the house back to the way it was. But the local authorities could not see any way to get, they literally have to build a new house. So they pretty much, they just demolished the house. It's just gone. It was just too much of a hazard. By April 11th, their victim, 15-year-old Randall Reffitt, he had been missing since May 76, so he was identified. He had x-rays of, he had been stabbed, evidently, and had x-rays, and the x-ray had caught some of his jaw teeth, and so this is how he was identified, through that x-ray. And he, again, a lot of these boys are ranging from 15 to 20. And it's just sickening. Just so young. So, and to already have been stabbed, this poor kid. On April 23rd, 26 more victims are added to the original indictment. So the original indictment had 7. This brings the total to 33, which is the most in U.S. history. The most. May 21st, 19-year-old William Kindred is identified by dental records. He had been reported missing in February of 1978. The police linked Kindred to being in a vehicle with Gacy prior to going missing. So someone had actually seen him with Gacy. In July, the sheriff's office does release a list of victims' effects found in Gacy's home. And we're talking things to help identify, like clothing, jewelry, and different things. And so they're trying to release these items to be helpful for victims to be identified, for people to come forward. So on August 28th, this is 1979, the trial for Gacy is set for January 7th of 1980. And the judge allows for Gacy to be tried on all 33 murders. So they're not going to try to do these these victims individually. They're just going to do it all at one time, all 33 at once. So September 12th, 2 more victims are identified. So it's 20-year-old Tommy Bowling. He was the one married. So he was, the remains that had the wedding band on them. So he was married. He was a father to a 3-year-old. So he had gone missing in November 77, and he had been having a rough time, according to his sister. 16-year-old Robert Winch, he was taken about the time of Tommy, like the same time frame. And they were actually found together in the crawl space. So they went missing in November 77. He had reportedly run away from a foster home situation. And he had a very distinctive tiger's eye belt buckle, which would be found in Gacy's home. And he didn't have any dental records to tie him to his body or anything, but he did have distinctive markings on his bone from a prior broken bone that had healed. This poor kid. So at this point, 19 of the 33 are known. So you still have quite a bit of young men without names on this indictment. And so they pretty much will be like, when they were finding the bodies to keep everything in order in the crawl space, they were literally having to number. So it was victim 1, 2, 3, upward. So it's just, I just can't even imagine. So October 24th of 79, so the judge rules for the taxpayers to pay for Gacy's attorney, which is the Sam Amirante. Evidently, Gacy had run out of money. He had been paying him up to this point, but they, basically the judge agrees to pay Amirante and not, put some kind of other attorney there. However, I guess they were, like, Gacy was going to try to auction off his items or vehicles or something to try to pay for it, but they didn't want any of his belongings, like, going anywhere. And so the county actually stopped the auction, and then they took all of his stuff, and then they put it in storage. And then later on, they would say they would sell his vehicle. Like in 1980, they actually sold, some things to help reimburse the county for the cost of his attorney's fees. Because they did agree, like, he had 2 attorneys. It was Sam and then another man. And so I think they were each getting about $42,000 or $50,000 or so for this time that they worked on Gacy's file. And this was coming from the county. I will say, so evidently that car that was auctioned in 1980 does end up in a museum. It didn't state which one. And of course, I will post, the crime museum that I went to in Tennessee did have Gacy's clown costumes, and I will be posting that again. I had posted before. November 14th, the youngest victim of Gacy's, or one of them, is 14-year-old Samuel Stapleton. So he had been walking home from his sister's house when he went missing. Before he was officially confirmed, there was a bracelet of his found in Gacy's crawl space, but they did confirm his identity through a skull x-ray he had had previously, which did show some of his teeth, and he had gone missing in 1976. 2 days later, 20-year-old victim David Talisman is identified using x-ray that had been done on his left arm. He had been missing since 1977, and he was identified on what would have been his 21st birthday. So the count now on known victims at this point is 21. So 21 known victims, and there are 33 total. So January 7th of 1980, jury selection is decided to actually come from Winnebago County. So they're in Cook County. So the judge is allowing for the actual jury to come from Winnebago. So they drive to Winnebago County, which is like 97 miles to the northwest of Chicago. But once the jury is chosen, they are sequestered for the whole trial, which is held in Chicago. So this was to kind of appease the defense, but also save as much money for Cook County as possible. Because if they had had to move everybody to Winnebago County, that would have been a big problem. So, and the judge knew that this was already going to be a very long, costly trial for the county. So February 6, 1980, the trial actually officially begins, and due to the horrific graphic nature of the trial, Judge Garippo bans anyone younger than 16 from the courtroom, which I 100% get that. Like, I can't even imagine. But to think, like, in the back of my head that, I mean, a big majority, or not majority, I would say, but several of Gacy's victims were not even 16. It's disturbing. So the jury is made up of 7 men and 5 women. The defense wants to prove that Gacy is innocent due to reason of insanity. And the prosecution wants to reflect the difference between being crazy, quote unquote, but 100% culpable, and knowing what you did was wrong and being responsible for what you did. So they want to show, okay, he might be insane, but he was culpable. He knew exactly what he was doing and covered up what he was doing. So there would be 5 weeks of testimony, and it was everyone from psychiatrists, lots of doctors, police, neighbors, family members of Gacy, family members of the victims, and so many family members of the victims attended every single day. And then some could not. There were several, it was like some were always in the courtroom and some could not. Greg Godsick's mother, she went every single day, and she wanted to make sure to talk to the press every single time. She wanted to talk about the boys and how innocent they were, and I don't blame her one bit. I mean, it is just, I can't even imagine. But I do, on the flip side, there were several of the boys' families that could not sit through there, that, went when they had to, but they just couldn't, they just couldn't be there. And then it said that a lot of the family were, of course, emotional. They were sobbing, especially about how the boys were killed, because Gacy had gone into, length about how the boys were killed, and that was conveyed. The police got up there and discussed this, about the strangulation. I mean, he lured these boys. He sexually assaulted these boys. I mean, these boys were tortured in some cases. And then family members also had to take the stands themselves to identify Gacy. So they had to just point at him and outline him, and face him. So these are very, very emotional 5 weeks, incredibly emotional. So the prosecution team did have like this board up, and it had all 33 victims with their pictures and their names. Now, however, only 22 were known, so there were 11 that are not known. So there was just a blank picture and then a victim number. But the prosecution wanted the jury to see these boys. They wanted them to see these boys, and of course the defense wanted it taken down. So there was a lot of back and forth between this board. This board was just, contentious, let's say. But I think I cannot blame the prosecution at all to put that in the jury's face and give a face to these victims as much as they possibly could. Another item that the prosecution used, so they had actually cut out the kind of trap door situation that led to the crawl space. So they had taken this wooden door, this part, and I'll post this too, this part of this crawl space, so they could utilize it as an exhibit. And I'll get into it, they would very much utilize it in closing remarks. It is noted in articles and such that Gacy actually smirked and laughed when John Sick was mentioned at all. And not sure why he did that. I mean, again, evidently Gacy knew Sick. There was a lot of contention on, his vehicle. And of course he robbed him, and then he had sold his vehicle to Rossi. And so there's just, I don't know what his agenda is, but Gacy in his 1992 interviews that we'll discuss, he does just say that he didn't even kill him. I mean, he just pushes away that whole situation, which is just such a lie. So yeah, but he smirks. I mean, he smirks about a victim. So he is pretty much, I mean, he's pretty much showing that he has zero remorse. And he does not, in fact, in interviews, he discusses these boys as nothing more than an object that he bought at a store, and that he can do with the object whatever he wishes. I mean, this is his point of view, that these boys are not humans, they are not souls, they do not, he can do whatever he wants with them, and that's exactly what he did. So there were victims of Gacy's that actually lived but did not die, and these were very important to the prosecution. So there is a young man named Anthony Antonucci. I don't think I'm saying that right. Anthony, and I think he went by Tony, was only 15 years old, and he worked for Gacy. And Anthony would describe Gacy kind of having him over or checking on. He was Gacy was very involved with his worker. He groomed these boys, especially the ones that were working for him and such. I mean, he was grooming them. So evidently he, had, I think Gacy had gone to check on Tony, because I saw an interview and it was kind of confusing, but I believe they were at Tony's house. So Gacy had gone to Tony's house. He had brought some alcohol, so he was feeding, this young 15-year-old boy alcohol. He showed him a heterosexual stag film, evidently. Afterwards, Gacy did, and he described this as what he called his handcuff tricks. And Gacy did this to a lot of his victims. But basically, Gacy had handcuffs, and he would put the handcuffs on himself and show himself easily getting out of them, allegedly without the key. But he did have a key. He used the key. That's how he got out. But then he would put the handcuffs on the victim and say, "Oh, can you get out like I did? Can you figure out the trick?" So Gacy does this to Tony, and he gets Tony in the handcuffs. And then Gacy leaves the room for some reason. Tony has a moment by himself. And Tony's like, "Well, I can get..." So he feels that he can get the handcuffs off of his right wrist. So he pulls out one hand. So he gets a hand out, and then Gacy comes back, and Tony is a wrestler. He's a high school wrestler. He's pretty strong dude. So he is actually able, when Gacy walks back in, he gets Gacy in a wrestle hold. And he gets the key out of Gacy's pocket or whatever. So he gets completely out of the handcuffs himself, and then puts the handcuffs on Gacy. And he states, and later, you'll be able to see interviews with him, he states how afraid Gacy is. I mean, completely goes quiet, and he tells Tony if he unlocks him, he will leave. He'll just leave him alone. So he does, Tony releases Gacy from the handcuffs, and then Gacy leaves. And Gacy did tell Tony that night, he said, he looked straight at him and he said, "You are the only one to ever get out of the handcuff trick," quote unquote, the only one. So yeah, so this was something that Gacy did repeatedly. Another survivor from actually way back. So this was the Voorhees. So remember in part 1, Gacy's initial time in prison was for a sodomy charge when he lived in Iowa. And so the child's last name, it was like a young boy, 15-year-old boy there. His last name was Voorhees. His dad was like a state representative or whatever. And so Gacy went to prison for that. Well, they have Voorhees come. I mean, this is years later. So that happened in 1968. This is now 1980. So Voorhees comes. They're going to have him, testify against Gacy. Voorhees is so visibly shaken, physically distraught. He can't even answer questions. So the judge excuses him. He cannot testify. I mean, this is so sad. And I did find something, I believe it's later, he had a horrible time. I guess there was an interview with another young man that knew Gacy from the Iowa prison at that time that stated, and he was just friends with Gacy. He had no clue what Gacy had done. Remember, Gacy lied. And so he actually talked to Voorhees, and Voorhees, he was just a mess. They were put in the same hotel by the prosecution, and long story short, it was just not good. And I think he had said that later on, his life was totally messed up by Gacy, and he survived it. And it's horrific. Just the things that Gacy did to these young boys. So whether they lived or not, it was horrific, every part of it. The prosecution was actually going to call to testify a young man named Jeffrey Rignall. So Rignall was a survivor, but they found out that Rignall had a book deal, so they didn't want him to testify for them. But the defense ended up calling Rignall because, he would state that Gacy was crazy, and that's what they were after. So Jeffrey Rignall discusses how in March of 1978, he had been given a ride by Gacy. Gacy had actually chloroformed him and took him to his home and sexually assaulted him, and then had dumped him in a public park. And on the stand, like, Jeff thought he explains that he did think that he's like maybe saw someone else in the house. Now, he is chloroformed. Who knows if he did, but this will come out like a little bit later. We'll talk about this, but this would lead people later on to question if Gacy had accomplices. But additionally, Jeffrey ended up collapsing on the stand and throwing up all over, so they had to like close the courtroom and like clean up everything. So Marion Gacy's mom, she does take the stand for the defense. And of course, she states everything about Gacy, like about how he hit his head and how, he had what the doctors had called early on, like a bottleneck heart. He had the heart issues right off the bat. She also went in to explain about his childhood and how Gacy's father was extremely mean and abusive when he drank. And it was very emotional, and of course she, was super upset. And she was upwards in years. Prosecution Terry Sullivan would state later on that while she was on the stand, she kind of looked and, she found John, staring at her. And so she was like, oh, there's my Johnny, just a little bit oblivious to the situation maybe. But, she was advanced in age by this time. So, prosecutor Bill Kunkel, so this kind of gets down to the closing arguments. So he stated to the jury, and this was very emotional, even Sam Amarante would discuss later, this whole situation. But Bill Kunkel did the closing arguments for the state. He did I believe it was a 4-hour close. But he stated that if the jury were to show mercy on Gacy, then there would be zero mercy on all of the victims. And he proceeded to take all the pictures of the victims and tear them up and throw them into the trap door in the crawl space exhibit. So it was an extremely theatrical thing, but it was a very emotional thing. The jury just needed that visual. And even Sam Amarante was like, he kind of felt like they had a chance, but he was like, nah, they didn't really. He didn't feel like they had a chance. So after 5 weeks, the jury does come back and finds Gacy guilty on all counts, like every single one of them. And they only deliberated for 2 hours. So they felt the prosecution definitely proved Gacy was knowledgeable about his guilt, that he did so much to cover it up, and that he, was definitely responsible. So now the jury would have to decide on whether or not, Gacy would get the electric chair. So Peace and Godzik's family in interviews very much wanted, Gacy to get the death penalty. And on March 13th, the jury comes back with the death sentence for Gacy, and the families of the victims, they always tell them not to show any, response in the courtroom, but they all applauded in the courtroom. So Judge Garippo, he does set the execution date of June 2nd, 1980, and this is, March. So the date is immediately stayed due to the immediate appeals that Gacy, in Illinois, you just automatically get the appeals. So I will say the front page of the Chicago Tribune shows prosecutor Sullivan. I thought this was interesting. He's giving like a really like big kiss to Rob Peace's sister. And I will post this picture. It's interesting. I don't think that would necessarily happen today. I've watched so many documentaries, and this prosecutor Sullivan, like, he is very advanced in age now, himself. And so it's just interesting to watch him talk and then see this picture. But anyway, March 14th, Gacy is moved to death row, which is actually a brand new facility called the Menard Correctional Center, and he is the 23rd man in Illinois history to be sentenced to execution. Then later that month, so we're still in March, 3 more victims are identified. So Kenneth Parker, he's 16, and Michael Marino, he is 14. So evidently these little guys were best friends, and they went missing together October 24th of 1976. And they had been hanging out kind of near a street corner where Gacy had been known to pick up victims. Like, they were just hanging out. Both boys were found in the same grave under the crawl space. And it is said that both boys were identified by dental records or x-rays. However, in 2016, and it really looks like there's differing articles on this, so maybe even, I think they had been working on it a long time, maybe as early as like 2012 or 2011. So with the help of her attorney, Michael Marino's mother, Sherry, she states in interviews she had never felt like the remains were her sons. Like, she just had a feeling they were not. So she had the body, they filed orders and such, and they had the body exhumed, and they paid for private DNA testing that they stated came back and said that the body that was said to be Michael's is not Michael's. So it is not related to her, is what they're saying. Now, I did watch, and this is in, and we'll kind of get into it, but she attests, that the state, I will say the Cook County, they're not agreeing with this testing. They say they have never gotten conclusive, evidence of this, and that, but however, they were the ones that knew all about when the body was going to be exhumed, but they didn't send people. And now this is according to Sherry Marino and her attorney. So I don't know what this is about, but the Cook County is they stand by the medical examiner, and evidently the medical examiner looked again. I don't know if he just looked at the original, but he stands by the teeth and the x-ray, examinations, the original identifications, instead of this DNA test provided by the mom. And again, I don't know why. And the Cook County, they seem to be earnestly looking for answers, and we'll kind of get into this in a bit. But according to the documentary on Peacock in 21, her attorney stated at that time that they were still working on it. So I couldn't find any update to this since really 2016. But that documentary came out in 21. So I don't know if they're still filing anything, like if her attorney's still actively working on getting, answers from the Cook County. But she stands by that that's not her son, but Cook County stands by that it is. So I don't know. Another victim, Daryl Sampson, who is 19 years old, he is identified with Marino and Parker, and he went missing in April of 76, so about the same time. And nothing else is known about Daryl. In May of 1980, Gacy's attorney, Sam Amarante, he quit. So he, right after, basically they get, the verdict, he's out. So he wants to move on because he wishes to pursue a book deal, which will happen and be called Defending a Monster. In July, Judge Garippo resigns as well to go back to private practice. So we're kind of seeing a pattern. I don't know if this whole case just kind of bothered these people so much. They're like, I'm out. So both of these people are like, I'm done with this. So in July of 1980, with the pressure of the families, so the 9 unidentified victims have an artist reconstruction done on their faces, utilizing their skulls and such. And I will post this picture as well. Additionally, Dr. Stein encourages families to come forward, telling them there is zero evidence that any of the young men engaged in any deviant sexual practices. So many of the families sadly weren't coming forward, the police were feeling like, in the county, just because of, I guess, connection to anything, stating that maybe their sons were, I don't know, involved in sex work or something. I don't know. In June of 1981, all 9 of the victims, unidentified, were given lovely coffins, and they were given a lovely funeral. These were donated by some of the funeral homes in the area, and then Cook County paid for some. So there was like donations and such. But they were all buried in their own individual graves, and they were all given headstones inscribed with "We Remember." And again, this was just donations in Cook County. So meanwhile, John is in prison, and according to his sister Karen, he is very adaptive. I mean, he is doing just like he did, when he went into prison in Iowa. I mean, it's like he just kind of does John, what he wants to do. He's constantly writing letters. He's writing about how he's innocent. He writes about how his attorneys threw him under the bus for the insanity plea. He was blaming his attorneys, the police. He was blaming everyone. He was telling everybody how he was getting railroad. I mean, it is exactly verbatim what he did when he went into prison for sodomy. I mean, same old story, same old John. In August of 1982, 6 paintings of Gacy's are sold at the Illinois State Fair, and they go between $20 to $45 a piece, and the proceeds go to, like, basically for money for more supplies and paint for the prison. So the paintings ranged on topics of like the 7 Dwarfs. He did a lot of Disney characters, and later on he would continue to paint and do such, but he did like an Indian chief, a landscape, and clowns. Like, he painted a lot of clowns. In June 6th of 1984, the Supreme Court does uphold Gacy's conviction. Evidently, there are some on the Supreme Court, which we'll get into, that are just totally against the death penalty. So it wasn't like a unanimous thing, but the Supreme Court overall, the vote is to uphold a conviction. Now, in 1984, in July, a company called Wayne Savings and Loan purchases the empty lot where Gacy's home used to stand. And it purchases for right at $31,000. So basically, Gacy had a couple mortgages on the house, plus this is like taxes and penalties and such, I'm sure, to the bank that had the mortgages. So a little side note. So Gacy's address was 8213 West Summerdale. So they do, I guess, eventually build a house, and it's not very, I don't know, there's differing dates to say when the house was built. Some say 86 and some say 88. So they do rebuild the house. They break ground, rebuild the house. The house is very lovely. You can look it up. I'm gonna have a link in the show notes to the house. So they do change the address to 8215. And we'll talk about that because there's more on the house. So we'll get to that. In 1985, in a 6-2 vote, the Supreme Court denies appeal by Gacy. So there were some more appeals going on based on the fact that Gacy was put to death by electric chair, and they actually, like, the state of Illinois changes over to like the injection. So I don't know if this is the point when they're doing that, but I believe it is. It's not exact on that, but Justices Brennan and Thurgood, like I mentioned, they on the basis period of voting against the death penalty. So they were the two holdouts on that. So it was like a 6-2 with them. And evidently that, Gacy isn't put to death. Like, he's not executed for another almost 10 years. So there was a lot of back and forth with this because of just the contention of the death penalty. And I get it. I mean, it's a tough call. I myself have mixed feelings about the death penalty. I will say there were a lot of interviews with people discussing how if Gacy is not, if he is not put to death, then nobody is put to death. Like, no one deserves it more, I guess, is what they were trying to say. So I don't know. It's contentious. It is very contentious. It's very hard. It's very, I don't know. I feel like it's case by case, and it's just hard to imagine. So, but it's extremely horrific to imagine him, completely killing, 33 people, and that's just what they know about. So, and we'll talk about that too. In May of 1986, Timothy McCoy is identified as a victim. So he is the victim Gacy mentioned that he picked up from a bus station and stabbed in his bedroom. So he was killed in January of 1972. So he was one of the earliest victims. And he was just passing through town when Gacy offered, to help him at the bus station. And evidently he had had some notable fillings that were finally able to identify him. In 1988, they do begin rebuilding the house on the lot. A neighbor would note that they should have just built a memorial for the kids who were murdered there. I agree. And that was said a lot. A lot of people said that. I mean, obviously, the owner of the property can do with it what they want. But, it would have been nice if someone had purchased it for a memorial instead of rebuilding a house. But May 10th of 1994, Gacy's execution is set. So that fast forwardeth from 88 to 94. So his execution is set. All the appeals are done with and everything. So it's set for the 10th. And thousands of people come out. There were protesters, against the death penalty, and then there were supporters. There were people everywhere. It was described as a giant circus, and lots of people wearing clown shirts. It was just like a big to-do. It is stated by the family. So none of the family of the victims or Gacy's family was actually able to evidently directly watch through the little window that they do. They did have them located in the prison, kind of in other rooms, and then they had to watch the execution on a TV, they said. Gacy's last meal was fried chicken and butterfly shrimp. The execution was set for 11:45 p.m. on the 10th, but there were evidently complications, and so he didn't fully pass away. Like, no one was told that he passed away until 12:58. So really May 11th, almost 1 a.m. It is said by the people that he ended up feeling more pain than expected, and of course a lot of people were like, not really caring what he felt. All of the survivors' families were just glad. They were very happy about it. So again, lots of, I can't even imagine being in their shoes. His sister Karen was in Illinois for this. She stated herself in interviews that she was able to spend a couple of hours with him. She hugged him. She told him she loved him. She said it was very hard, because she never saw the evil in him. She never saw that side of him. So later on, she said that she could see the evil in his actions, and she really wished that he had at least apologized to the families, but, he didn't. And he said over and over, he didn't feel sorry. He didn't feel anything. And then, by 1992, he's completely lying and saying he had absolutely nothing to do with the murders. So then he's saying, oh, I can't be sorry because I had nothing to do. I don't know anything about it. And evidently his very last words were, kiss my, so very nice, right? So, May, June-ish of 1994, so 300 pieces of Gacy's, artwork goes on auction. So evidently 2 businessmen purchased the pieces, and then the next month they have a bonfire to burn the artwork. So basically they purchased it. I believe they paid about $12,000 for all the pieces, and then they burn it. And there was like an article and a picture, and it does show Rob Peace's father throwing, some of the art onto the bonfire. And allegedly, the seller of the art, and it didn't state who owned it at that time, was going to donate a portion of the proceeds to Gacy's victims. And not sure if that really happened or whatever. I did notice that there were a lot of the victims' family had filed civil suits against Gacy, but I don't know if anything came of that. It seemed like everything that was sold of Gacy's went to Cook County. And then another thing, so during his time when he was incarcerated, like Gacy did, want to capitalize on his art. So he was selling a lot of the artwork, and Illinois he was going back and forth with, Cook County, as far as they didn't want him making money. He was getting like quote unquote free room and board. He was costing the state thousands of dollars. And so they wanted to halt him being able to make any money while he was incarcerated. Gacy also created a 1-900 number. So people would pay $1.99 and they could call in and listen to a recorded message that answered questions by Gacy. So he was trying to make money while he was in prison on his notoriety, and through his art. And his art, if I'll try to post some of his art. His art wasn't great. I don't think anyone would have bought his art if it wasn't by him, just because of who he is. So, anyway, Cook County, there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of lawsuits regarding the money he was making while in prison. That was a source of contention. So, jumping now, so we went from 1994. So, jumping way ahead, in May of 2011, the Cook County Sheriff, Tom Dart, he announces they are reopening the Gacy cases, to try to find the identity of the final 8 victims not named. And so this was a push from a detective that worked for the cold case department, Detective Lieutenant Jason Moran. So he was kind of pushing. He was told to work on some cold cases, and he was like, well, these are cold cases, these victims. And they knew that DNA testing had come such a long way that now they could use DNA to find out, and familial DNA and all those things. So they did have the 8 bodies exhumed, and so they took the DNA from the actual skeletal remains and such, and teeth or whatever they had, to get DNA profiles. And they did hold a press conference and updated their website to ask for people to come forward with the DNA if they had a family member that was missing, during those years that Gacy, was killing. So that was 2011. Amazingly enough, literally by kind of November of 2011, a Gacy victim was identified as William Bundy. So he was a 19-year-old. He had actually worked for Gacy, and he had gone missing after going to a party. And this was, his family actually had come forward in 1979 when they were trying to identify bodies, but William's dentist actually did not have his records. Like, he didn't save his dental charts. He had destroyed them. So there was 0 dental charts, which was the only way to identify in 79. So luckily with the DNA, they could really connect the dots. So it's kind of like his family kind of knew that he was probably a Gacy victim, but they didn't know for sure. In July 2017, James Jimmy Hackinson, who was only 16 when he went missing in 77, after traveling to Chicago from his home in Minnesota, he was finally identified by DNA submitted by his siblings. So his mom had actually tried to get him identified in 1979. However, she didn't have any dental records, and so she couldn't do it at that time. So again, he was another one like William that, thought that it was but couldn't prove it until later on. In October of 21, Francis Wayne Alexander was identified. He had gone missing in 76 or 77, and awesomely, he was finally put to rest, with a name, instead of just a victim number. So this is so 21 is really the last identified victim. So there are still 5 victims that need names. So I will be posting. There is like a website that you can go, of course they'll help you get DNA, process to see if you connect with any of these, victims. They're just trying to find the names of these victims. I will talk about, so I read and read and read and watched so much of this. I feel like I'm like a Gacy connoisseur, but it's just sickening. Fascinating and sickening. But I did actually watch the Netflix documentary first, and then I did watch the Peacock documentary, and of course they're very different. The Peacock one actually came out in 21, and it does have a lot of conversations with Karen, and of course Karen is the tie to Arkansas. It is not clear through ancestry, like when Karen moved to Arkansas, but it appears, so she was actually living in Chicago in like 1966 for sure. So Karen and her husband Ron, they had actually were from Chicago. They were married there, and there's a little caveat on that too that I found. They had a daughter in 65, and then they had a daughter in 66. And one of their daughters is actually interviewed in another show called like Evil Lives Here. So I did watch that as well. And it really just discusses, just the hard time that the family went through because, again, Karen was super close to John. They had a very close connection. It does talk about her and her daughter, talk about how they visited, and her daughter talked about how her Uncle John was a clown and he was a fun clown and all these things, like, these good things that once all this came out about him just was ruined. It just ruined their lives. Like they would get death threats, and they would, went through so much. Like it literally ruined their lives. And also, Karen, it's hard to imagine. You don't want to think ill of a brother that you were very close to, that you love, that you had a great connection to. So that was hard. And that's what the Evil Lives Here discusses for the most part. So they do live in Arkansas. I did try to reach out to Karen's 2 daughters. So Karen passed away actually last year. And then she does still have her family that lives in Arkansas. It looks like they live very close to me in Arkansas. And I understand, I reached out to her 2 daughters on Facebook, and they did not respond. I completely get that. It looks like I have a mutual friend, but I'm not going to go there. I don't want to step on their toes. I don't want to, I completely get their silence. They have done interviews. It's been on TV. Like, that's what they want to do. But that, obviously, John visited Arkansas. He spent time here. And in fact, John was kind of everywhere. And we're going to talk about that real fast because the Peacock documentary really focuses on maybe kind of believing some of John's like stories about how maybe he wasn't alone in his killings. His attorney, like he did have an attorney, where is her name? Karen Conti, that had helped John towards the end, kind of more in 1993, like, he was executed in 94. So kind of towards the end, like they just wanted to work with Gacy, a fascination type situation. And I think Karen ended up writing a book or whatever. So she mentions that she had found that there was paperwork, like receipts or something. He's a businessman, that John was literally out of town during some of these victims' deaths or abductions. Well, I don't believe that. For one thing, John never slept. He was a crazy driver. When they say out of town, they did not have any like actual evidence to point to a specific day that these boys were taking or specific time. And John Gacy himself, and I will say the Peacock documentary is all interviews that he conducted in 1992 with the former FBI profiler Rob Ressler. And Rob, I mean, you can tell he didn't believe a thing Gacy was saying. I mean, you could tell Gacy was lying. He would say stuff and show you things like how you could quote unquote strangle someone, but he's like, but I didn't do that. So he's pushing everything away. He's denying everything. But the Netflix documentary, all of those conversations, those taped conversations that Gacy later on says did not happen, quote unquote. And I will say the Netflix documentary came out a year later than the Peacock one. But, it is all conversations with Gacy that happened at the time of his arrest, that happened at the time of his trial, when he was actually being, I won't say completely honest, but a lot more honest than he was in 1992. So, do I believe he had accomplices? The big question was, did Mike Rossi, did David Cram, which were the two guys that worked for him that were digging, under his house, did they have more to do with it? That is the big question. Did they? The police did state that they felt like they knew more than they let on. And I do believe that. I think that I will say, these were young dudes. They were all on drugs. They were all pill popping. Karen talks about how when she went to visit her, John, in those, years leading up to his arrest, that he was very different. She knew he was pill popping. The detectives that were surveilling him talked about how he was popping Valium or something. He was giving, drugs to all of these kids that worked for him or whatever. So do I think they knew stuff? I just think that they were getting paid by Gacy. There was allegedly, he would do things for them to get what he wanted from them. They were working for him. And then he literally said that Greg Gotzik, dug his own grave. So they weren't the only people digging under his house by any means. And then even Anthony Anatucci, which was a survivor, he talked about how he did some digging for Gacy. So there was a lot of, he had a lot of young men in and out of his life between 72 and 78 working for him, digging. So do I think that Gacy had help in his murders? No, I do not. I do not believe it. Myself, I could be wrong. Hey, whatever. But he was a liar. He lied about everything he ever did. So no, I don't believe he had accomplices. Could Rossi and Cram know more? Sure. I think they were underneath the house quite a bit. And evidently, so Karen said in an interview, and I think it was I've watched so many things. It was an interview in The Evil Lives Here, and she talked about how she went to visit John and her mom when they had first moved into the house, and that the house stunk immediately. So there was always kind of a smell. And, Gacy would always tell people it was the dirt, it was the sewage, it was, the crawl space stunk or whatever. I have such an aversion to smell. I would not have been able to live there if that really is true. But yeah, so there was a stench that was, and he told Rossi, he told Cram, he told all of his other, teenage workers that this was a plumbing project. And he was constantly working, and they were constantly putting the lime. There was hundreds of bags of lime going in under the house, and the lime was to actually help with the decomposition. And these bodies were buried. It's not like, the police went in, they looked in the crawl space at the first search. They didn't see anything. So, again, yeah. I mean, I would say if you're going to watch anything on Gacy, definitely watch I think it's called The Tape Conversations. It's on Netflix. It's the documentary on Netflix. And it has Gacy talking and telling the truth kind of early to investigators about what happened. And he talks about peace. He even says, he talks about on December 11th, peace, he got Peace to go home with him. He, got him, wrapped up in his rope. He had kind of, how he strangled, some of the men had rope around their necks. He put him in this, like, he called it his rope trick, but he got the rope around him and he kind of does this little trick. He tightens it, and basically Rob, was strangled to death. And then he's dead. So he finds, Rob dead. He strangles him to death, basically, after he had sexually assaulted him. And then he needed a place to put him. So he popped Rob into the attic, he said, because he needed to go to bed. He needed to clean up. And he said, I needed to clean up my room. Stuff was on my bed. I needed to get it off my bed. These boys were just objects. And so he would put these boys, either in the crawl space or in his attic. He would stuff them somewhere until he disposed of their body. And 29 of them were disposed on his property. And when his property was, too busy, no more real estate there, then he was dumping them in the river. This was his MO. He tells the truth about it to a certain extent. Now, I will say he did tell this detective, Tovar, he told Tovar that he had killed up to 45 when asked. That was the number. So do I think he killed 33? No. So the question remains, we know that he was coming to Arkansas. I did look up missing people in Arkansas, and there are a couple, and I'm going to post that link as well. It shows missing, and you can look per men, because I do believe he killed men. I don't think there was anything that would be contrary to that. So there were some young men that went missing between 72 and 78 in Arkansas. And I know from conversations and interviews, so Karen, it looked like right before, in 78, I guess it was for Thanksgiving, she said that John had come to visit. So Marion was living here in Arkansas with Karen, and John came to visit, and they spent time together, and it was a very nice time. They went shopping, they did Thanksgiving, they shopped for Christmas, he bought for Christmas, and so John was here. He was here in Arkansas. So big question, did he do anything here? Is a serial killer, controlling themselves when they're on vacation? I doubt it. And he was in a frenzy. I mean, if you look at the dates of these boys, there's 33, and it's like, and you keep saying the same thing, like 77, 77, 70. He was in a frenzy. So that's a big question. We know he was in Arkansas. Did he do anything when he was in Arkansas? Yeah. So, and would he, and if he did, he would probably have his same MO. He would dump in a river. So that's what I think. So that's a big question for investigators. But I'm sure, there was some looking into that, I would think. I think, cops are smart. So interesting enough. Now, the other thing I want to visit about before I close out. So, Gacy's property. So there is, and then there's another thing. So I was looking, and I dive deep, guys. I do. I go into the Ancestry. I go into the newspapers.com. A lot of interesting, try to get as much fact as I can. So it does look like, I'm not naming names or anything, but it does look like that Gacy has a nephew that he actually, in 2012, he was given 24 years sentence for sexual assault of a 12-year-old girl. I'm not going to say his name. It is public record, but this happened in 2012, and he was given a 24-year sentence, and it looked like he does live in Illinois, so it could very much be his other sister's son. So it just said his nephew. So just FYI, I don't know. That was interesting. Little tidbit there that was found. But yeah, that was found in the newspaper, in the Chicago Tribune. Now, like I said, something else. So Gacy's house. If you go online, the internet is going to tell you that his house is haunted. And I will say, the house now. And a lot of people do visit the residence. Evidently, there have been several paranormal investigations over the years. And I did try to track down people that have owned the house, but it looks like the 8215 West Summerdale, it turns over its owners quite a bit. So that is interesting to me. I mean, if any house is going to have bad spiritual vibes and such, or any type of paranormal, I would think it's that. But you go on Reddit, you go on the internet, there are people that are like, yes, that house is haunted. Obviously the paranormal investigation is not posted necessarily about this, but it does say that there have been investigations over the years. I would love to see this house. So if you're ever in the Des Plaines area, suburb of Chicago area, this is going to be on my bucket. So when I go to Chicago, I have not been to Chicago. I will say I want to see the Home Alone house and then the Gacy house. Two houses. But anyway, and then do the Ferris Bueller's Day Off adventures. But all the things. But just saying, is that house haunted? So I'm going to leave you guys with some questions, and I would love for you guys to give me some feedback. Let me know if you think if Gacy did have accomplices or not. I don't believe it, but I would love to hear it. Do you think his house has paranormal activity? I can see that it probably does. Who knows? You know how I am. Yeah, it's just some interesting questions. And then also, do you think that he was active when he was visiting his sister and, his nieces and nephew and his mom in Arkansas? And we're talking, he would have been coming here. We know he was here in November of 78, kind of, that time frame. I'm sure there were lots of other times that he would visit. He was kind of always on the move, so to speak. And again, this man never slept. Anyway, so just saying. So let me know your thoughts. I need a palate cleanser again. I am going to be, you guys know the situation with the Gal Row episode, so just stay tuned. It will come out soon. And then our live show. So the live show is going to be posted. I have a lot of fun content and a lot of other opportunities for some in-person interaction in 25. I do have some shows coming up. Maybe not like produced by me, but it will be starring me. So anyway, so stay tuned. And I love you guys very much. I appreciate you listening. Share, listen, follow, all the things. And let me know what you want to hear. Love ya. Bye.
So they did decided to go to a spot in Arkansas, Texas. Like I said, okay, very disturbing. Now they're moving into this.
Unexplained Arkansas.